From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host, a man who, unlike our president, actually does know what caused the Civil War, and that's David Feldman.
Yes, I know what caused the Civil War.
What's
George
that?
W. Bush launched an illegal invasion of Iraq without anyone telling him that the Sunnis and the Shiites don't get along. That's Civil War, right?
Yes, that's the one Andrew Jackson could have stopped if he had been alive 116 years before. Okay.
Trump 2020.
Okay. And we also have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello. This is really going to be an unusual show, as you know, Steve and David and Jimmy. So hold on, listeners.
We are going to do something different on today's show, a little departure from politics and current events. We're going to talk about something that David and I actually know a little bit about, not judging by that little opening segment we did, but we're going to talk about the phenomenon of laughter. This is a topic I know Ralph is personally particularly fascinated with, not necessarily the jokes, but the actual vocalization of the laughter and what different laughs mean, if anything. So we're going to have a wide-ranging discussion about that in the second half of the show. In the first part of the show, we're going to go back to discussing something David and I know virtually nothing about, and that's music. We welcome Tufts University professor Ani Patel to talk about his book, Music, Language, and the Brain, about the relationship between music and language and how the brain processes musical rhythm. But, of course, it wouldn't be the Ralph Nader Radio Hour if we didn't sprinkle in a little talk about corporate malfeasance by going to the National Press Club, where our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, the deputy dog of the corporate crime beat, will tell us the latest goings-on in the suites. But otherwise, it's all music and laughter today on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, so let's get started. David?
Dr. Ani Patel is a professor of psychology at Tufts University. His work focuses on music cognition, the mental processes involved in making, perceiving, and responding to music. His book, Music, Language, and the Brain, is about the relationship between music and language and the processing of musical rhythm. Dr. Patel has served as president for the Society for Music Perception and Cognition and received the 2009 Music Has Power Award from the Institute for Music and Neurologic Function in New York City. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. Ani Patel.
Thank you.
Yes, welcome indeed, Dr. Patel. You're really a pioneer in this area. When you started working in this area, you weren't that well received by your academic colleagues. What? Studying music and the brain and music and language. But now you're an established expert, and I'd like to start by asking you to talk a little bit about music therapy that has been studied to affect stroke victims.
Yes, well, music therapy is actually a much older field than the field I'm in, which is music neuroscience, the basic science of music and the brain. Music therapy goes back to the 1940s and after World War II, I believe. But what's happening in recent years is there's a growing interest in connecting music therapy to the basic kind of science that I and my colleagues do to try and understand how the effects of music are actually happening in the brain and how we can optimize therapies based on that sort of understanding. And so one of the areas that's pretty exciting is the use of music to help people recover some language function after strokes that damage their language abilities, leading to something called an aphasia, which is a loss of language due to brain damage. And there are labs now actively researching how music-based therapies can help people recover some speaking abilities, building on this old observation that sometimes a non-fluent aphasic who can't get any words out or barely get out a few words can sometimes sing an entire song fluently and so well that you wouldn't even know they had any kind of brain damage. This is an old observation. It led to a therapy called melodic intonation therapy in the 1970s, developed at the Boston VA Hospital, and then now more recently it's being studied from a neuroscientific standpoint actually at the Harvard Medical School by a colleague of mine, Dr. Gottfried Schlaug, who's trying to understand the brain mechanisms involved in this therapy and how it seems to be in recruiting parts of the brain that normally are involved in singing to help take over for some of the damaged language areas of the brain.
Well, you know, one thing that you broke ground in is you've written a paper about a sulfur-crested cockatoo named Snowball. And this really fascinated you and opened up a lot of avenues. Can you describe how you stumbled on the cockatoo, Snowball?
Sure. So Snowball is the sulfur-crested cockatoo. He's a pet. He's not my pet. He lives at a bird shelter, and he came to light through a video where he seemed to be dancing to the beat of music, actually synchronizing his movements to the beat, which doesn't seem that special to us. It's seen in every human culture. Little kids can do it. We don't need any special musical training to do it. But until Snowball, we hadn't seen any evidence that other animals had this response or capacity. And there was speculations that maybe this was a uniquely human ability. And I had some kind of hypotheses that maybe other animals could do it, but not any kind of other animal, maybe only certain types of other animals. Animals that could learn to imitate complex sounds like we do when we learn to talk. This is a very rare ability. Most animals just have instinctive vocalizations that they are born kind of knowing how to produce. They don't learn them, including all other primates besides us. But some animals, like parrots, are famous examples, can imitate complex sounds, and I had speculated that this led to the kinds of brain circuits that connected hearing and motor centers of the brain that might also support this ability to move to a beat. So when Snowball came to light, it seemed to fit this idea, and so I jumped on the chance to actually test him scientifically to see if he really could synchronize to a beat and do it at different tempi, and if you change the tempo of the song, and we showed that he could. That was the first example of another animal that could do that. And surprisingly, this ability, which seems so simple to us, doesn't seem to be available or possible in other primates. Like they've tried to train monkeys to tap along with the beat, and they never seem to quite get it. They always tap a little bit after the beat, as if they're reacting to it rather than anticipating it, which is what we do spontaneously when we move to a beat.
And no dogs, no cats, no horses.
Yeah, that's the other interesting thing. That's exactly right. So those are all non-vocal learners. They all have instinctive sounds. They don't learn their vocalizations. And none of them so far have shown any evidence of moving in time to a beat. And the hypothesis that I put forward was provocative because it said not only do they not show it spontaneously, that they could never actually learn to do it. Even if you tried to train them, they don't have the right kind of brain circuitry to do it. So it's raised interest, and other animals have been studied as a consequence. Right now I'm actually involved in a study of horses, seeing if they entrain to a beat, because they don't learn their sounds, and there's anecdotal claims that they do move to a beat, and if that's true, then the hypothesis is definitely wrong. But that's how science proceeds.
Well, studying what you have been studying sparked a few questions which may not be right in the middle of your expert research, but a part of the penumbra. And so let me ask you these questions quickly. On the subject of music and culture, if there's a common neural mechanism, why are there so many different responses by people to different kinds of music, from acceptance to rejection?
Well, I think that points directly to the fact that music is this really fascinating mix of biological foundation and cultural learning. And that shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, language is exactly the same way. There's a strong biological foundation for language, and our capacity and desire to acquire language as children is universal. But of course, we all end up speaking different languages based on the cultures we're raised in, and they're largely mutually unintelligible. And music is really no different. I think there's a capacity and an urge to acquire musical behavior, but the traditions we grow up in are very different from one to the other. And so you may end up loving a music that leaves somebody else totally cold, not only across cultures, but within cultures. That's not to say that we don't share some of the same mechanisms for processing that music.
How about developing music appreciation? Let's say you love hip-hop and punk rock, but you can't stand classical music, Haydn or Chopin or Beethoven.
Okay.
First of all, why is that? Is that more cultural, and can you develop a taste for it?
Yes, I think it is cultural. I think that level of musical taste is very much a cultural thing, and I think I've seen actually cases of people developing a taste for music that they did not grow up listening to. Actually, what I find more interesting is cases where people had no prior exposure to a music at all, and then the first time they hear it, they fall in love with it. I mean, that's interesting and hard to explain. And you hear this sometimes, people who grow up listening to country western music for the first time hear a symphony by, Mendelssohn, and they're just overwhelmed, and they've never heard anything like this before or thought that anything could express feeling in that way and reach them in such a deep and profound way. And how does that work? It's not based on learning that tradition. It's the first time encounter, so like falling in love at first sight with somebody you've never seen before.
What I find fascinating, Dr. Patel, is the different attitudes toward different cultural music. I mean, like if you hear Chinese music and you're living in this country as a American, it doesn't sound very attractive. And so across cultures, you wonder, how can this music really excite these people? I mean, they're going crazy, dancing, listening to it. To me, it sounds, awful, tinny, whatever. That's primarily culture, or is there a vocal, neural aspect to it?
Well, I think of course, it's culture, but culture has a basis in the brain because the brain is the organ of culture. It's what we use to learn culture. And so, for example, you might not like the nasal voice quality of Chinese opera, and maybe that turns you off because that's not a voice quality that you're used to hearing. Whereas if you grow up with it, it's something that you find very moving and appealing. And that even happens in our own culture. Some people don't like country western music because they feel it has kind of a nasal quality to it.
Chamber music, yeah.
Yeah, and they really like opera, whereas the country music fan will say, God, opera all sounds like screaming to me. How could you possibly enjoy that? So I think there is a large cultural element to what people end up enjoying, which is not to say it's infinitely malleable. I mean, I think we've had really interesting experiments in musical history. Schoenberg decided to get rid of what we call tonality and create a new musical system that he called the 12-tone system or atonal music, and that was very successful as an avant-garde enterprise, but really has never caught on as a mainstream form of music, despite his predictions that the mailman would be whistling atonal tunes in a couple decades after he invented it. So there may be some cognitive constraints that lead us towards certain types of musical structures, and there's actually evidence of some similarities in musical structure around the world. So it's not totally random, but I think there's a big, big role for culture. Yeah.
Well, let's look at the role of trauma here. 150 years ago, before the phonograph, music was a rare, other than humming to yourself and singing to yourself, which was quite extensive in folk cultures, but music was rare entertainment, at holidays or festivals and so on. Now, of course, music is available 24/7. So here's my question. Given the plasticity of the brain, what effect does daily loud music played by musicians or daily listening to music in one's ear have on the brain in the long run?
I'm so glad you asked that question because there's some recent discoveries about that are just fascinating. So there's this phenomenon that's come up recently in the auditory science world called hidden hearing loss, and that refers to damage to the auditory system that's not obvious and it often happens with prolonged exposure to loud music. I mean, we're all familiar with having listened to something too loud, maybe a concert, and then our hearing sounds a little muffled the next day, and then it seems to come back to normal, and everything seems fine again. And in fact, if you go into an audiometry test at your doctor and you take the hearing test where they play tones and see if you can hear them, your performance initially is bad after that loud event, but then it comes back to normal according to those hearing tests. But what was discovered a few years ago was that prolonged hearing, the loud sounds, actually damage auditory nerve cells in your inner ear. And those cells actually die. They irreversibly die. And those cells are not so important in simply detecting whether a sound is present or not, which is what you do when you do those little beeps and boops hearing tests into doctor's office. But they seem to be really important in allowing you to pull out one sound from a complex mixture of sounds, which is what we all have to do when we listen to, for example, a conversation in a crowded bar or in a party or in a social situation. We're faced with this, what classically is called the cocktail party problem of understanding one voice among many. And that apparently just really suffers with the death of these neurons. And you don't detect it in your standard hearing test. And yet what you're essentially doing is you're killing off cells that are going to allow you to understand speech in these complex settings. And that's why it's called hidden hearing loss. And we think it's really underdiagnosed, especially among young people who don't realize what's happening until later in life when they really suffer from great difficulty in these situations.
Which leads me to my next question, Dr. Patel. Is there such a phenomenon as musical addiction, or less likely, habitual musical rejection? But how about musical addiction?
Yes, great question. It's a particularly good question because neuroimaging, including by colleagues of mine in Montreal like Robert Zatorre, have shown that when people experience pleasure in music, they are activating some of the same ancient brain reward centers that we know are activated by biologically important behaviors like eating and reproducing and are targets of drugs of addiction like cocaine. So music activates these areas, but the interesting thing is music never seems to develop into an addiction in the sense that the way that, clinicians identify an addiction where it has negative consequences on one's life. It ultimately ends up making you unhappy. It has these kind of typical characteristics where you need more and more and more of it to get the stimulation that you're looking for, where you engage in negative behaviors in order to get the desired item. So people can love music, but it never seems to evolve into a pathological addiction in the way that we think of addiction today.
Well, let's look at the motivational aspect of music. I've often been skeptical when I see, mass rallies and let's say the old labor rallies and farm rallies, and on the stage they're singing "This Land Is Our Land" and other folk music that has a lot of social justice content. And the reason why I was skeptical is because I never saw much transfer from people hearing inspirational music and then going back to their room or whatever and really getting involved. It wears off very, very rapidly. It might be a kind of divergence as well, a kind of distraction. Am I being too strict here?
That is a really fascinating question, and I wish there was some way to measure that, because I think people have very different intuitions. So your intuition is that these kind of social uses of music for political reasons are maybe just more of a diversion than an actual enabler of social change. I think other people have other beliefs, and there's a wonderful film that came out a couple years ago. It won the Academy Award documentary for Best Documentary in 2013, I think, Searching for Sugar Man, about a musician who in South Africa, he was an American musician whose music here was kind of lost, but because of a record that was imported to South Africa during the apartheid era, it totally took off, and it resonated with a lot of the young South Africans who were, against apartheid. And the documentary talks to a lot of these people and the powerful effect it had on catalyzing kind of their belief that the system is fundamentally wrong and that, something had to be done about it.
But it may have a cognitive impact.
Yeah.
Rather than follow up in terms of getting people more active and engaged and
well, we don't know. I mean, that's such a fascinating question. I wish there was a way to measure that. I wish we could actually find some way of measuring whether people that are motivated by music that has social content actually then go on to do things about it. I mean,
well, let's take a test from history. Yeah. Let's take it to the next step,
Okay.
Dr. Patel.
Okay.
Here's music that was composed deliberately to motivate certain kind of behavior. It's martial music, military music, and it seems to be similar across cultures, like the militant music of one culture 5,000 miles away from another. It seems to have a similar theme, and it's designed to generate, quote, patriotic fervor, but more specifically, military aggression. And I'm, for example, referring to Onward Christian Soldiers, that song that led thousands and thousands of Christian soldiers heading from France and England and Germany and Italy into the Crusades well over 1,000 years ago. And the lyrics for Onward Christian Soldiers are extremely aggressive. So talk about martial music as a motivator and cross-culture.
Okay. Well, martial music is definitely used to train, and I think part of that, and you see this, today in our military, and it's actually pretty interesting that groups of soldiers will march together to a beat and in large groups, and this actually is not how we fight battles at all. It would be kind of suicidal to walk around in large groups marching in lockstep. You'd just be one big target. But why do we train that way? Well, one of the theories is that this kind of music, it really emphasizes rhythm and beat, and it gets people to synchronize their movements, which is what you see when soldiers are all marching in lockstep together.
Yeah,
and
let me interrupt you on that, because it raises a very interesting question. Have you ever heard the drum beat that the Roman legions used as they moved on the Roman highways to fight the tribes on the fringe of the empire? Here's what the beat is. It's absolutely mesmerizing. Here's the beat. Boom, 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 boom. That's got to have a neural impact, huh?
Yeah, no, we know that rhythm into the beat has a very strong neural impact, and it does something to your motor system. It gets your motor system extremely activated, even if you're just listening to it. It primes you to move, and of course, beat primes you to move, not just move, but to move in step with others. And there's a lot of interest in whether or not that creates this sort of sense of a social bond and this sense of a bigger self, that you're part of you merge with others into this kind of super self that has this shared movement, shared purpose, shared identity, which of course is exactly what you need when you're going into battle, right? You don't want to feel like you're alone. You want to feel like you're part of something much bigger than yourself. And so maybe that's part of why we see that kind of music in so many cultures.
Well, tell me, if that motivates behavior, that kind of militant, but social justice folk songs don't, what does it tell about our brain?
Well, I think that the militant music motivates movement and kind of synchronization with others. Folk songs often imitate more reflection about the state of things kind of cognitively, and then that may later motivate action that is not physical, immediate action, but it's more later kind of political action. And as I said, I don't think we know yet whether it actually leads to concrete actions more than, not.
You noticed during our Civil War, Dr. Patel, both the rebels from the South and the Union troops were launched into battle against one another with drummers and trumpets. And this, of course, is designed to increase the violent pressure against the adversary. That's really sort of like the end point. Any observations on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of use of music is definitely designed to it's the shock and awe principle, right? I mean, you want to scare your enemy as much as possible. And so if you have this group of soldiers coming towards you in Civil War times, it's all marching together, and then you hear these loud drums and you hear these horns. It's sort of all, auditory stimulation, and those are all arousing sounds. The sharp attack sounds of the drums, the kind of high-pitched energy of the horns. There's a reason that those horns are used as military instruments and not oboes or banjos or something like that.
Or violins.
Violins, right.
I just wanted to get your reaction to this. What's the difference on the brain between music with lyrics and the same lyrics read as poetry without music?
Oh, my gosh. Well, we know there's a big difference in just how meaningful people find those things. There have been experiments showing that when you pair the lyrics with music, people find that the whole thing the lyrics themselves more evocative and kind of meaningful than if they're just stated by themselves. The music seems to complement them and enrich them. And, of course, they're going to be differently processed by the brain because you're not activating only the language centers when you present the lyrics. You're getting all the music areas involved as well and making those two things interact. So, for example, if you think language is typically more left lateralized in the brain and music is more right lateralized in terms of the hemispheres and their involvement, we know it's not all or none, but there's still biases. The right brain seems to be more involved in music, relatively speaking, and the left more involved in language, relatively speaking. Then using music and lyrics together is going to integrate more of your brain than just hearing the lyrics alone. And, of course, it's probably going to activate more emotional response to the lyrics because of all the power that music has to arouse emotion.
So you think some ancient cultures, without any knowledge of neural behavior of the brain, had at a point, from their own interest, that is, when they wanted to ban music because it led to fostering the animal spirits and dissipation of human behavior?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think we see that in history, right? I mean, Plato wrote about how certain music should be banned from the Republic because it's corrupting young people, certain styles of music. And, there are certain traditions where secular types of music are prohibited, and the belief is there should only be music for religious purposes and so forth. Who was the famous Western medieval cleric? Was it Augustine who wrote about how he loved listening to these church pieces, but he was sort of apologizing to God in his diaries that he knew he should be paying attention to the words, but he kept getting seduced by the beauty of the music in his listening. So it was this perpetual battle, right?
Well, this is obviously a work in progress, finding out more and more. Certainly, music is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and those who are selling this music know something about human behavior beyond mere supposition. And what works and what doesn't work, and with adolescents what works, and older people what works, and churches what works, and on the battlefield or pre-battlefield what works. So we want to thank you very much. This is a conversation that can continue, and the listeners can really develop their own views on this when they're talking with each other. I do think there's a serious problem on hearing capacity being damaged, and of course that's an old story going back to the horrendously loud rock bands and the musicians themselves losing their hearing after a few years. So how would somebody get in touch with you, ask you a question, or give you a feedback? Do you want to give a website or something?
Sure. My website is through the Tufts University Psychology Department. I have a web page there. It's easily findable by just searching on the Internet. That's probably, and then my email is listed there, so that's probably the easiest way to contact me.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We've been talking with Dr. Annie Patel, who's broken ground in the connection between music and language and the effect on the brain. And we hope that it will lead to a lot of critical and more incisive views that people have about music when they turn on the radio, and half the radio stations are on music. And it's all in the way of getting people to have more refined feedback and, of course, to protect their own hearing and the well-being of their own families. Thank you very much, Dr. Patel.
Thank you, Ralph. Bye-bye.
We've been speaking to Dr. Ani Patel, whose book is Music, Language, and the Brain. We will link to it at ralphnaderradiohour.com. In fact, we want to ask you, our listeners, to write to us with stories about how music may or may not have led you or inspired you to social or political action. So go to ralphnaderradiohour.com and tell us your stories about that. Now let's check in with corporate crime reporter Russell Mokhiber. Russell?
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, April 28, 2017. I'm Russell Mokhiber. More than half of the high-ranking Securities and Exchange Commission officials who left the agency since January 2016 have landed at law and financial firms, with Debevoise and Plimpton leading the pack. Debevoise, private equity manager Blackstone, and other firms hired 15 of the 26 SEC officials Bloomberg tracked since their departures were announced in 2016 and 2017. Firms tout the expertise their recently acquired colleagues gained at the agency. Government watchdogs, however, cite concerns about the possible influence these individuals have over their former co-workers, their commitment to the agency's mission during their SEC tenure, and the possible misuse of government employment as a stepping stone to a bigger paycheck in the private sector. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Now we're going to turn to the laughter segment of the program. And like I said at the top, I know this is a particular interest of Ralph's, a particular fascination, to the point where, Ralph, you actually commissioned a project called Project Laughter and commissioned a young man named Rick Rundhawa to record 100 different laughs. So why don't you tell us about that topic and why you're so interested in it?
Well, for a lot of reasons. I mean, first of all, producing laughter is big business. Obviously, comedy, humor on television, radio, live comedians, it's a big business. So obviously, it's considerably important to a lot of people to make people laugh. I noticed, however, that the laughter is most robust when it's unprofessionalized. That is, laughter between friends around a dinner table or at a bar is far more robust than people watching a comedian crack jokes on television. So that began to perk my interest in the sense that there are different kinds of laughter. Like people have different fingerprints. Well, people have distinct types of laughter. And what do they reflect? Do they reflect their personality? Do they reflect who they are laughing with or laughing at? Is it a nervous laughter that you see so many youngsters interspersed words, not provoked by any jokes or anything? It's just a nervous interstitial laughter between their abbreviated talking. So that was another reason. And then I learned, because I had a friend, and somehow I made him laugh on the phone, and he would laugh for a full minute, gasping for breath. And after a while, I said, this really has a nice physical effect. It's almost like exercise. And, of course, there's a lot of medical studies now showing that the long-term effects of laughter, it can improve your immune system, relieve pain by causing the body to produce its own natural painkillers, increase personal satisfaction in difficult situations, help you connect with other people. It can improve your mood, lessen your depression or anxiety. And there's even such a thing, David and Steve, as laughter yoga, that a person from India in the subcontinent began to promote. Clubs who just get together and engage in laughter yoga. So all this is very fascinating, and fortunately, listeners, we have on our show David and Steve, who are comedians. They have performed on a stage, and they're going to be weighing in with this as well. Another aspect that fascinated me was whether you can laugh about serious subjects, like, let's say, Jon Stewart on The Daily Show or Stephen Colbert on his show. They dealt with serious subjects designed to make you laugh. And as Colbert said, don't think you're getting any news from my 7-minute performance. So he wasn't under any illusion that the laughter of the audience, directed to the satire and the witticisms, would actually produce any serious civic movement or civic challenge to the politicians, for example, were the objects of ridicule. And that interested me. The question there is, can we laugh ourselves serious? That is, can we laugh ourselves into recognizing certain abuses and injustices and doing something about it. The other thing that was interesting to me is that if you don't have the right laugh, if you have a bizarre laugh, you're being interviewed for a job, you're gone. Or imagine you're in a dental chair and the dentist is puttering around in your mouth, and you ask the dentist, when you can talk, a question, and the dentist responds and then laughs like this. I mean, so you see, obviously different kinds of laughter convey signals of a person's personality, a person's conformity, a person's rebelliousness, or a person's frailties. And overall, I just would conclude that there is a censorship on some jokes. Years ago, you could go into a bookstore and buy ethnic jokes. That is, you'd buy Italian-American jokes, Jewish joke books, Scottish joke books, what they used to call Negro joke books. They're completely abolished now from sale. So they're considered offensive. And therefore, that whole ethnic joke tradition, which swept through America in the 19th century and early 20th century, sometimes to actually reduce tensions between people, is now gone. So that's the bevy of reasons, Steve, for why I'm interested in all this.
And you identified different types of laughs. You gave them names. Do you want to go through that?
Yeah, that gets focused on different kinds of laughs. And for example, I've noticed there's a zigzag laugh that some people have. That's usually just two quick sounds. Then there's another kind of laugh. I call it the click laugh, that can roll out to over 50, 60, 70 clicks with, as I said, my friend, gasping for breath to keep rolling out this laughter that is consuming him. Then there are the teeth gnashing laughs, as if the sound is moving from the tongue through the teeth. The one that invites a lot of commentary is the belly laugh, that is usually very loud. Listeners may remember on Saturday Night Live, Dan Aykroyd had that kind of celebrated belly laugh. And then there are the sis type laughs. They're the kind of laughs that almost never get to the base of the tongue, never mind the lungs. And finally, there are the chuckle laughs. Those are laughs that often are on TV with the laughter to the comedian. Well, there are many more types of laughs, but you get the point. So we asked Nick Randhawa to record at least 100 different laughs that were spontaneous. They weren't induced. And he developed them in different types or prolonged discharge, like the click laughs that went on and on. And the important aspect of all this is that this is not trivial stuff. With all the torment going on in the world and all the bad news, this allows us to understand each other more in many, many different dimensions. I asked some anthropologists who study cultures all over the world whether there's any anthropological study of laughter, that is, the vocalized laugh itself, and they didn't come up with anything. There are studies on different kinds of comedy, different kinds of satire, different kinds of joking relationships between kin in various tribal cultures, but no studies actually on the laugh itself.
So, David, what do you make of this? What is your, we're obviously stand-up comedians, comedy writers. What is your relationship to laughter?
Well, I have an annoying laugh. I guess I could control it. I don't want to, but I have a giggle and a loud, boisterous laugh when something's really funny. And I don't know what that's about.
Do you want to give us a taste of it?
Tell him a joke, Ralph. There was a joke, Ralph, you did in one of your campaigns, and I'll just use this to cue David, is you were complaining to the Washington Post how they weren't covering your campaign, and they said, well, it's because you can't win. And you said, well, you still cover the Nationals.
Right. And so I guess that would be my nervous laugh. I think my loud, boisterous laugh is a form of communication born out of comedy clubs and writing rooms. If somebody says something powerfully funny, I guess it's involuntary. I want to communicate that's funny across a crowded room. So I think it starts when I was starting out in a comedy club, I wanted somebody to know that I thought that thing was funny. And then when I moved into comedy writing rooms, I guess it's a softer laugh, but sometimes it's as loud and not always appreciated.
Why do you say it's annoying? What's annoying about a laugh?
I think it's almost a shout of approval that can be screaming. It's like, I think that's funny. I'm Zeus from Mount Olympus, and I've ruled that joke is funny. And it's this loud, boisterous laugh that drowns out everybody else's laughter.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because in prior programs, David, I've said something that I thought was a little funny, and you would react with what I can call a burst laugh. It was like,
right.
You want to imitate that again?
I don't know if I can.
What was that all about?
But I would say that, with you, it might be obsequiousness. Subconsciously, I'm showing deference to you and laughing, on a primal level. It might be a power thing where what you said may have been funny but not hysterical, but because of I'm the beta, I might be laughing more than it deserves. With all due respect, Ralph.
Well, I've noticed you've done it quite a lot. It makes me feel good, actually.
Oh, okay.
Do you know, someone on TV the other day said that he's never seen Trump laugh. And, come to think of it, who's ever seen Trump laugh other than in family, private situations? He smiles a bit, but has anybody ever seen Trump laugh? Does that worry you?
Well, it's interesting because when you're a comedian, you're in the room and you're doing your act, you're the only one not laughing. You're conducting this orchestra of laughter, but you're the only one not laughing, and that is a power position because you're the one causing the reaction, and to laugh at your own jokes is not good. It diffuses that because, as they say to comedians, if you have to laugh at your own jokes, why do nobody else does? So I'm wondering if that is also a power thing with Trump. He's conning us, and he's the only one who's not laughing.
Well, he stands out, obviously. If he's in a crowd and he's on the stage and someone cracks a joke at the mic and everybody's laughing and he's not, that does put him in a power position, as you say. On the other hand, there's another explanation. He doesn't really have a sense of humor, which for a lot of people raises some questions about the person's personality, ego, etc.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think he has some sort of sense of humor because, the way he's able to mock his opponents and get reactions from the audience says at least he's got that expressively. I think laughter puts you in a vulnerable position. When you laugh or you throw your head back, you're actually vulnerable. You're caught off guard, literally, because of what makes you laugh a lot is the surprise is a huge element of that. So I bet he doesn't laugh a lot because he's on guard and he does not want people to see him vulnerable on a very basic primal level.
Well, on that point, there's an article recently in the Washington Post by Hank Stuever, Stuever, and the title of the article is "The Trump-Inspired Comedy Bubble Might Be About to Burst." And he says, 100 days in, TV's Trump humor has hit a wall. How could it not? The material is so bountiful, the comedic workload so relentless, and daily occurrences so absurd as to blur into a meaningless and easily lampooned travesty of leadership. And the point of his article is it's not moving the needle. It's not possible to laugh a president out of the things that he's doing that they're criticizing. It's not changing the minds of Trump voters. And he thinks that it's going to wear itself out because all these comedians are making more and more jokes about the same person in the same ways. So he thinks that this comedic avalanche is going to burn itself out, which is a commentary I've never heard anybody make because, humor is almost considered infinite. People have an infinite capacity to laugh and snicker at jokes or comedy or satire. Do you agree with him, David or Steve?
Well, I have some strong feelings about that. Rationally, you would think, okay, it's got to stop. It's got to burn out. Two things are going on. One is corporate America dictates what we see on television. We're going to see Trump jokes to the end of time because those are the rules. They're going to be, as long as he's in office, we're going to see Trump jokes because that's what television does. They make fun of the president. And what that does, it kind of indemnifies it helps the president because if we're all laughing, it feels like, well, it's not a totalitarian regime. Look, you're allowed to make fun of the president. And then he gets in on the laugh. They'll laugh at it, and it's all okay. So it really strips the comedy of any power when the president, again, he doesn't laugh, but his family will laugh. We'll find them all going on Saturday Night Live and making jokes about themselves, and everything's okay. We're not a totalitarian regime. When, in fact, that's,
You think that's dangerous?
I don't know if it's dangerous. I just think it's self-aggrandizement when comedians think they're moving the needle. The president is always in on the joke. The White House Correspondents' Dinner, I think it was great for comedy that Trump didn't show up because it says that the jokes are getting to him. But in the end, 2 years from now, he'll show up. He'll be in on the joke and everything's okay. And meanwhile, he's, not enforcing antitrust legislation and stripping the environment. And we're all laughing. Everything's okay.
Well,
so I think laughter.
I think it also, this kind of satire on Trump is crowding out more serious but well delivered commentary. John Oliver tries to combine both. He tries to combine very serious investigative material, say on Trump and other politicians and corporations, but it's always laced with kind of irony and that kind of humorous twist that he has. Let me just read one of the jokes, and I think this illustrates it, and then both of you can comment. This is out of the Washington Post article I just mentioned. I'm quoting. Some of the show's jokes were strong and perfectly delivered in Trumpian bombast. And the writer then recounts one of the jokes, which is now in quotes. A me-first country gets a me-first president. Me! I've ruined everything I've ever touched. Companies, cities, marriages, toilets. I will use this office to enrich myself and my weirdo family. Then tweet us into a war with Hawaii. I have the power to destroy any country on earth, but I promise you, it'll be America first, end quote. So that's an impersonator of Trump at a satiric pitch. What do you think?
I think the jokes exist not to change him or his follower. I think it's to soothe the rest of us. It is to relieve that tension. It is to kind of acknowledge that, yeah, this is crazy. So I don't even think it's aimed at that. And I think it will. I mean, I was tired of Trump jokes during the campaign. They were like airline jokes for comedians after a while. But
there's a general rule among comedians is that you don't make a joke about a joke. In other words, you can't do a bit about Everybody Loves Raymond. You can't say, hey, did you see Everybody Loves Raymond last night? Can you believe what Ray was? No, it's already funny. And the problem with somebody like Trump is he's a joke. At what point, when you have a president who doesn't know how the Civil War got started, he's a joke. So
a friend once said to me, how can you satire satire?
Right.
So if Trump is a ongoing daily satire, how can you satire him? Is that what you're pointing out?
Yeah, absolutely.
David and Steve, you've been on the stage a lot with audiences. Share your experience with laughter as professional comedians.
Well, it's interesting, Ralph. I have a couple points to make. David was talking about laughing at other comedians, and I found that to be true, too, when I was on stage and say it was late at night and there weren't too many people in the audience. The comedians would be standing in the back of the room, and I couldn't see them because the lights were in my eyes, but I could identify them by their laughs. They each had kind of a signature laugh, and the laugh usually occurred when the joke didn't work or in the in-between parts. And it was basically them in the back saying, I'm here, I'm supporting. But they were not natural laughs. They were vocalizations that I call mating calls. It was like, bleh, oh, yeah, that's Billiam, yeah, that's Rick Overton over there. I could tell without even hearing it. So that's the one thing. The other thing you were talking about is, why does laughter on TV, is it different than when you're sitting around the dinner table? And that absolutely has to do with intimacy, and it has to do with how close you are to the person. I mean, I'm talking physically close. I mean, David knows this, that people in the front of the room laugh a lot harder than people in the back of the room. The joke didn't get less funny as it traveled back to the back of that room. It's the level of intimacy you have with the performer that makes you laugh harder at something. And so when you're watching something on TV, you're not going to laugh as hard because TV is beyond the balcony. So if something makes you laugh really hard where you're sitting in your living room and the baby's crying and the phone's ringing, then that's got to be really funny. But it has to do with intimacy. And that's why at the dinner table with people you know who all have the same frame of reference and have all sorts of codes and shortcuts between them that don't need to be explained, the laughter is going to be harder because you're right there and you're talking to people who have all of that same frame of reference.
Can you teach ordinary people, not as professionals, but just ordinary people, to crack jokes? And
yes.
Why is it that some people can remember 20, 30 jokes and other people can't remember more than one if they're lucky? Can you give us some comment on that?
Competition, when comedians or human beings are sitting around telling jokes at each other, a joke will trigger, if you're competitive and you want to be a performer, as you're telling me a joke, it'll trigger, oh, that reminds me of this joke. So I want to tell that joke when he's done with that joke. If you want to tell jokes, jokes will trigger other jokes.
My wife was getting hip surgery a few years ago, and we were in the sort of anteroom waiting to, she was prepped and ready to go, but there were people, behind scrims just all waiting to go into surgery. And she wanted me to talk to her and entertain her. And I said, I don't know what to say. I was, trying to read a magazine. And she said, teach me a joke. So I said, okay. And so I taught her this old Rodney Dangerfield joke, which is, I went to the psychiatrist and he said, you're crazy. And I said, I want a second opinion. He said, well, you're ugly too.
Mm-hmm.
And we spent about a half hour with me getting her to tell that joke, first to remember the logic of it, and then to get the rhythm right so that it would, she could deliver it. And now she knows that because, we practiced and practiced and practiced. Now she can tell that joke and actually get a response. But yeah, she learned that joke.
When I'm on the stage talking to a large audience and I'd say something that I think is true about some situation, but I lace it with a little irony or a twist of humorous words, I can actually gauge how informed an audience is otherwise, depending on whether they laugh at it or don't laugh at it, because some of it requires a predicate of knowledge. Have you experienced that?
I think the only reason I do comedy is because if people aren't laughing, I don't know if they're even listening anymore. If I'm not getting a laugh every 15 seconds, that's why it would be hard for me to write drama because I don't know. Are they listening? Are they still there? That's
what's with timing. It's listening to the audience. It's a communication. And so laughter in a classroom where I think most comics get their first laughs, you're hanging on every word. You can't be a class clown unless you're hanging on every word that the teacher is saying.
And the other thing about jokes and laughter is people can't laugh when they're confused or bewildered. So every time somebody's laughing at something you say, that means whatever you said crystallized into something that made sense. And so it's an indication of understanding. It's a signal of understanding.
Well, I've often in my travels around the world noticed the following. In the most burdened societies with poverty, misery, tragedy, they've developed an incredible folk humor to get through the day. I mean, really funny observations. Did you come across that at all in your travels? And that is, they have a higher level of daily folk humor than more prosperous countries that don't have that level of daily tragedy, pain.
What do you mean by folk humor? What does that mean?
That it's just generated in ordinary conversation. It's not memorized the way Proverbs are. It's just generated. It's almost part of trying to get through the pain of daily living.
So it would be like a story. They're telling stories.
Or just 7-8 words, like Bob Hope style.
Well, I think what you're probably hitting on there is oppression, and that it seems like people who are oppressed, they use humor to deal with it. So when you're prosperous and in a position of power, you're part of a dominant culture, then you don't need humor. That you don't need that pressure release because you're in charge. And
I disagree.
Okay, then tell me what you think.
Well, I think the best audiences are conservative, rich Republicans because they laugh fearlessly at everything, including themselves. I'm not saying they're good people, but they have no moral compass and they're willing to laugh at anything.
Well, I'm not talking about the laughter part of it. I'm talking about generating the laughter. So when you're in the power position, you don't need that stress relief. But if you're in the oppressed position, the lower status person, that's how you survive.
Right.
There's a story about Hitler in the late 30s was being massively lampooned by a cartoonist in a British paper. And whenever Hitler met any people from Britain, this is before World War II started, he would constantly raise this cartoonist lampooning him as if he wanted to send a Messerschmitt over and destroy him. And the people who wrote about this indicated that dictators in particular hate to be lampooned and satirized. You remember at the White House Correspondents' Dinner in 2011 when Obama got up to make fun of everybody and himself, he spent about 4 minutes making fun of Donald Trump, who was in the audience. And everybody was laughing uproariously, except for Trump. And apparently he left the dinner furious.
Right. That's why they say that's why he ran for president. But I cannot get in that mind of his. So I guess maybe that's true. I find that comedy is about hatred. I mean, I always think, were you going to say something, Steve? Because I was going to go off on it.
Go off on it.
I think good comedy comes from anger and hatred and isolating a target. Sorry about the noise in the background. To me, with live comedy and television, I can't speak for movies, there's a fascism to comedy. I've decided what's funny, and the audience is going to come along with me because I'm powerful, I'm strong, I know what's funny, and if they don't laugh, we'll sweeten it. I mean, that's what they do on television. There are hits on television, but a lot of those shows have laugh tracks, and there's a dictate coming down from the people running the network. This is what's going to be funny. This is not funny.
To what extent do professional comedians censor themselves, consistently censor themselves?
If they want to get rich,
including you, Steve, and David, are there any words, phrases, topics you think would make hilarious comedy, but you just won't communicate them?
I don't think so. That may have been true in an earlier age, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And, all the comedians say Lenny Bruce died for our sins because he lampooned the Catholic Church and got, thrown in jail for it. But I think you can do and say anything. You listen to anything Louis C.K. talks about in his latest special, the first thing he talks about is abortion. And he opens with that. It's not a closing bit that you prepared the audience for. He opens with that. So somebody like Louis, he has found a way to just be able to talk about anything. So I think there are fewer taboos as far as comedy goes, and I think Dave would agree. I don't think there's anything you really can't talk about as long as you're punching up.
I don't think you can go on Saturday Night Live and talk about how your iPhone is made and make jokes about it.
I think you can do that, sure.
You think that's a touchy-feely subject, the iPhones?
Well, I think he's talking about how they're made and that, you know,
you mean in China with serf labor, you mean?
Yeah.
I mean, the whole idea that they're jumping into nets, that instead of making working conditions better, they go, hey, you know what? Instead of that, we'll put nets out there, catch them, and then throw them back into the factory.
That's a no-no?
No, I just did it.
Yeah, but I don't know if you could do that early on in that story. There was a story about 5 years ago. The New York Times broke that story about Apple and the women jumping to their deaths, so they put up nets. I think if you would pitch that to Saturday Night Live, they'd say no. They're Apple. They're sponsors. It's too sad. It's too depressing. Once it becomes part of the vocabulary, once somebody starts making jokes about that in the culture, then it will filter up and they'll take a chance on network television. But I don't think they're going to name names, corporate names, early on in a story like that. We're going to have to cut this off, but
that's it. That's our show. I want to thank our guest today, Dr. Ani Patel, whose book is Music, Language, and the Brain. We will link to that at the RalphNaderRadioHour.com website. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, where we talk a little bit more about music and laughter with both Dr. Ani Patel and Ralph on laughter. Welcome, podcast listeners. First, listen to our extended conversation about music with Ani Patel.
God, it's so important to figure out a way to measure whether or not music with social content is actually having an impact on social behavior.
Yeah. Like Joan Baez and all the 60s music. I just saw a lot of it was swaying people, and then they drifted away when you started talking about picking up petitions and clipboards.
Absolutely, because you can't hear the lyrics.
You can't. That's right. You can't hear the lyrics
because you've gone deaf.
It's the reason. It's also the reason Ronald Reagan was able to use "Born in the USA" for his campaign speeches, not knowing that it was anti-Reagan.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's a really good point.
That's another area too. Yeah, that's another area to discuss. Yeah, I think that was great. Yeah. Let's do it again sometime. Yeah,
sure. I mean, if you want to get your listeners really talking, and you could ask them to write to your show with stories about how music has or has not led them to be active in social change. Issues.
Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah.
Professor, are there any cultures that have zero music? Have they found any anthropology?
No, and that's such an interesting thing. I mean, this is one of the true universals of human culture. They have never found a human culture, no matter how small, how isolated, how remote, that doesn't have music. That's one of the things that leads us to believe this is something that goes really way back in human history.
And that's true for humor, too, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that's one of the universals, too. Yeah, language, humor, gesture, music. And, some things that we thought were universal are not, like numbers. The concept of numbers is not universal. Names for colors, all kinds of other stuff that seems, creation myths are not universal. There are tribes that don't have any creation myths.
By the way, before we leave, do birds make music? All their songs have a communicative purpose. They actually have a communicative purpose, or do they just make it because they like the sound?
Yeah, there's an ongoing debate about that. So you do see, most biologists would say birdsong is functional. It serves to attract mates and defend territories, and it happens at certain times of year for specific reasons, typically due to hormonal fluctuations. On the other hand, birds, there are definitely cases of like birds singing without an audience. So, like a male bird will sometimes just be singing and there's no female nearby. And so people say, well, he must just be enjoying himself and this is just pleasurable. And, probably it is pleasurable. Evolution must have made it pleasurable to do this behavior. Otherwise, they wouldn't spend so much time doing it. But then, people come back and say, well, that's just practice. He's just practicing because he knows he's going to have to really attract a mate one day. And he's just kind of testing out different things and then to refine his song so it's the best it can be when he does sing towards a female. And there's some evidence for that. And so it's this ongoing debate about whether animals who sing, quote unquote, do it just for fun at all, ever, or if it's always just purely a functional behavior.
I found out, Ralph, why hummingbirds hum. They don't want to pay the ASCAP fees.
I have to remember that one. Actually, hummingbirds. Yeah. Hummingbirds are actually, there's only 3 groups of birds that learn their songs. All other birds are like chickens and pigeons, just have innate calls, right? But actually, that's the vast majority of birds are like that. It's only songbirds, parrots, and hummingbirds that are actually learners and vocal learners. And hummingbirds actually sing these beautiful, complex songs. You just don't hear them because they're so high-pitched and so fast. You have to slow them down to hear them.
And my nephew, who's an ecologist, he's studying areas in southern Venezuela, right, he's sort of the edge of the Amazon. He's recorded, these are spectacular songbirds with long Indian names, and they're bigger than our songbirds. And they're very rare, obviously. And he's recorded them all, and he's teaching the natives before they get wiped out, before the songbirds become extinct. Yeah. He's teaching them the sounds and connecting them to the names and the natural history. Huh. Yeah. And by the way, I've just done a fable, which you might want to read, called Animal Envy.
Okay.
I've done a fable, which I think you'll find quite interesting, given your work.
All right. Is it published as a book, or where is it?
Yeah. It came out about 5 months ago. Yeah, Animal Envy, it's called.
Animal Envy. Cool.
That's right.
Well, I actually collect interesting bird songs. So if your nephew wants to send me a couple audio examples, that would be great.
Oh, that's good. I'll put him in touch with you.
I just want to point out to David that the hummingbirds don't have to pay the ASCAP fees because everything they sing is public domain.
You can milk this for weeks. This is
a lot of Stephen Faulkner. A lot of Cape Town races.
This is called comedic anthropomorphism relating to hummingbirds.
It's a niche market.
Very niche. I think
that's very cool. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Doctor.
All right, you're welcome. Take care. Bye now.
Now listen to this segment where Ralph, David, and Steve, we went a long time talking about humor and American culture.
I think there's a lot of censorship going on. That's what standards and practices are all about by the networks like NBC, CBS, ABC. It's not just commentary about their advertisers that they don't like. It's what's called poor taste, ethnic comments that are reflective of what they think is bigotry. But let's look at the big picture before we conclude, Steve and Dave. Comedy is big business. It's now saturation. You can get it on radio, TV, on your computer, on your iPhone, anytime, day or night. You can look at it as kind of a constant wave, like millions of Americans are supposed to be laughing constantly around the clock. At what point does it preclude our being a serious society, spending time being a serious society, whenever we are confronted with injustices, about the only permissible programs on cable and other electronic media is to laugh at it, to satirize it, to make fun of it, but not to really go into it and mobilize people and give emails for contacts and start new citizen groups or enlarge existing movements to have a more just and fair society that can allow people to fulfill their life's possibilities and to advance, of course, the twin pillars of a sane society, which is peace and justice. I mean, to what extent in the aggregate, it becomes basically an erosive force against a serious society?
I disagree, because I think you're asking too much of it. I do a benefit every year for Public Citizen, of which I'm on the board, called Stand Up for Main Street out here in Los Angeles. And it's a stand-up comedy show. David's been a part of it. And I get a room full of 500 people together, and we have 6 or 7 comedians on. And in between, Rob Weissman gets up, and he makes just like a 10-minute pitch about what Public Citizen is doing and what the issues are. That's in the middle of the show. Then we go back to the comedy. And that event raises a lot of money for Public Citizen. In fact, we just got a rather large bequest from someone whose relationship was deepened by going to that show every year. And we were able to cultivate that relationship because of that. And the drawing power was laughter. So the laughter is not necessarily changing the thing, but it's drawing you in. It's the shared community response to all the bad stuff that's going on. So I would say it does have power in a certain sense to move the needle, just not in the way that we're expecting it to. Like Trump is going to say, oh, that joke was very trenchant. I'm going to change my behavior. That's not going to happen.
Well, you see, you're giving a good example, but all bad situations often have exceptions and good examples. In fact, the New York Times just praised Trump in an editorial saying, well, he's come up with a good idea. If he's going to build and repair America, bridges, schools, sewage, drinking water systems, public transit, he's suggesting a gas tax, which is long overdue. And every penny added to your gasoline bill is $1.5 billion a year. But overall, the Times doesn't think Trump is a very good president. So I'm looking at the bigger picture, Steve, that there is such a thing as too much of a good thing that crowds out attention, crowds out the use of the public airways. You have all kinds of comedy shows, but you don't have a cable station dedicated to students or to workers or to consumers or to patients or to women or to men or to any of our dreams and hopes. You have 600 cable channels, each one sillier than the other, and really low-grade stuff. I don't know how they even make money.
I just think that being able to be funny is an incredibly powerful thing. And, of course, you can use that for good or ill. I'm not necessarily convinced on your premise that it is a distraction, because I think it is a way to build community, and I think it's a way to get people to understand an issue in a way that only humor can do. And everybody I know wants to be funny. And why do they want to be funny? Is because when somebody's laughing, that means they understand what you're saying.
I think what you're saying is there's a good way to do something and there's a bad way to do something. And the commercialization of comedy is not the best way to do it, with luminous exceptions taking note of.
I've had as we're talking, I think I've stumbled into something like an inner narrative about the future of comedy. I met Jeremiah Tower. He invented California cuisine in the 70s and the 80s. His idea was, instead of flying in fish from Chile, use the local ingredients, that you can't really know what a city is like unless you smell it and you taste it, and it's in the animals and the herbs that are grown locally. And he changed the way we eat. When I was a kid, nobody talked about food. Food was ubiquitous, but nobody talked about how it was prepared. Now all we do is talk about food, and everybody's an expert when it comes to food. I think the same applies to comedy. Is more and more people are interested in comedy, the art of comedy. They talk about comedy a lot, the same way they do with food, and it gets down to taste. And it's a good thing, because do you have taste? And that conversation is going to continue for the next couple of decades when it comes to comedy. People are going to be discussing their taste in comedy. It's going to be much like food, where people have conversations about comedy and whether or not it tastes good to them. And I think that's a good thing, because it reflects your politics, your whole belief system, what you choose to laugh at. It's a choice. Ralph, are you still awake?
Let me ask you a couple generalization type questions. How would you grade commercial comedy today? Not both live comedy and television comedy. Just generally, would you grade it lower than, say, 50, 30 years ago? And tell us who you think the greatest comics today are.
Well, I mentioned one. As far as the greatest comics today, I think Louis C.K. is going to be on Mount Rushmore. David, who do you like?
I think there's a guy named Doug Stanhope. I like absolute truth. That Doug Stanhope has a special called Beer Hall Putsch. I don't know. Yeah. And he just talks about euthanasia, an experience that he had with euthanasia that was absolutely true. I'm looking for absolute truth. I think Dave Chappelle, is amazing because he's speaking the absolute truth. And the jokes, I don't even know where there are no jokes. It's just that you're laughing at the truth. To me, that's what's momentous.
I don't think, like you do, Ralph, that it's oversaturated or that it's hard for us to judge past eras, because comedy and laughter is so subjective. It is just like food. And we are going to laugh at things that we know about, that we have a frame of reference for. And I think there is more freedom than there ever has been. And there's certainly more political commentary than there was in the 60s when the Vietnam War was going on. And I think that's a good thing. I think humor bespeaks a healthy society.
We don't have corporate satire, though. We have political satire. We don't have a corporate satirist.
There are some big late evening jokes about VW manipulating the software to get more noxious fumes in people's bodies, or the GM ignition switch defect. They do make fun of the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico, the oil spill. But it's interesting that I haven't been able to get either of you to give me an overall estimate. I mean, you can say the evening news is not as good as it was. It's too fluffy and frivolous compared to 40, 50 years ago. Or people will say, our culture is in decay overall compared to 50 years ago. TV is an even bigger wasteland than it was called by FCC Commissioner under John F. Kennedy, Newton, Minow. But we all know the quantity of comedy on TV is vast. How do you grade the quality? I mean, when do you think that it's cheap, it's pandering, it's not really funny? How do you grade the quality of our cultural obsession with comedy?
I think you're going to have high and low humor. I mean, Shakespeare dealt with high humor, and he did fart jokes too, Chaucer. So I think you're going to have the entire spectrum. What's different now than was, say, 40, 50 years ago is the low humor wasn't allowed, or the low humor was very niche on the fringe. Mm-hmm. And now I think what it says about a society is it's actually more democratized. It's more socially acceptable. Back 40, 50 years ago, there were 3 channels. Now there are hundreds of channels. So there's a lot more choice, and people can go to the places to find the thing that appeals to them.
Let me give you 3 words and comment on it. Amos and Andy. How's that fit what you just said?
Well, it wasn't considered as low. It was in those days. It was more acceptable. You could do that. Now, that is one of the things that's different is, there are certain things that are not, it's not funny because it's just not funny anymore, because we're beyond that. Our experience, our civil discourse is beyond that. And I think that's actually a good thing. That Amos and Andy would not be funny anymore.
Well, I think it would be funny if you're democratizing comedy, then it's still funny. Not to us, but certainly Donald Trump and the alt-right.
What about that, Steve?
I think that's
a lot of people.
Yeah, that is a lot of people. We were talking about low humor versus more highbrow humor. And I think Amos and Andy in that day wasn't, because it was acceptable, was not, it was not really considered that low humor. It was, I don't know if I gave a good answer to that.
Well, minstrel.
Let me end, because we all have to go. Let me end on this. Are there any good books on humor? I know it's often said that if you ever have serious study about humor, you're not going to get very far. And there are conferences that study humor with academics, and they're not very funny when they try to be funny. So are there any good books on humor, and not just books of jokes, but books talking about humor you'd recommend to our listeners?
Cliff Nesteroff has a book called The Comedians that came out last year. It's the history of American comedy. And every page, you go, wow. I don't know if it explains why we laugh. I know that there was that theory about the mechanical incrustation of the brain. I can't remember the author. I think he wrote it in the 60s, that we laugh to escape the mechanical incrustation of our brain. Do you know who I'm talking about? I can't remember. I kind of cling to that. I think that's what people ultimately laugh at, is breaking free of some kind of chain.
Well, I don't have any books in mind, because I think it's hard when you analyze the comedy. And, I think we laugh as humans, and I believe we're the only species that does laugh. because we have this ability to think abstractly and anticipate and be surprised in a way that goes away from that anticipation. So, I think it's unique to us. Attempts to analyze it always end up falling flat because it's ever changing. It's a moving target.
Well, there are lawyer jokes and accountant jokes and doctor jokes, but the lawyer jokes seem to have the most legs. Steve and David, can one or both of you end this program with a short joke?
Well, I will say that Freud, what the influence Freud, I skimmed on humor, Freud. I think good humor comes from hatred and violence and ad hominem attacks where somebody's being hurt. That's my personal taste. Where I think good comedy is where you say something, let the chips fall where they may, and you're hurting a bad person, preferably punching up. That's my...
Well, why don't you leave our listeners with your favorite short joke, either of you?
Well, my favorite Rodney Dangerfield joke. I think this is a perfect joke. And Jackie the Joke Man is a student of humor. He says this joke has been in the ether for more than a century. And the joke is, my sex life is horrible. My wife cut me down to once a week. That's not so bad. 2 guys I know she cut out altogether. And to me, that's a perfect joke because it reveals character. The guy is such a loser that he's competing against the other guys who are sleeping with his wife. Plus, he's attacking his wife and himself at the same time. To me, that's the perfect joke because it's hostility towards his wife and hostility towards himself. And then Jackie the Joke Man, who's a student of jokes, gave me a book about jokes. I can go get it. He says that he shows to me that joke has been around since the 19th century.
Yeah. Steve, do you want to weigh in with one of your favorite jokes?
My favorite joke goes right to the edge, and that's one of the reasons I really like it. It's completely clean, but it goes right to the edge, the subject matter, the whole thing. And I'll analyze it for you afterwards. Little kid's walking down the street past the construction site. He sees a welder's helmet. He puts it on his head and starts bopping down the street. A couple minutes later, black limousine with tinted windows pulls up. The window goes down. There's an older man. He summons the kid into the car. Young man. Kid gets into the car with him. The car starts driving. The man says to the child, "Do you know what the word sodomy means?" The kid shakes his head no. He says, "Do you know what the word pedophile means?" Kid shakes his head no. "Do you know what the word pederast means?" Finally, the kid takes the helmet off and says, "Look, I got to be honest with you. I'm not really a welder."
What's great about that joke is the joke is at the kid's expense, that he doesn't know what those words mean.
It's
right.
It's so taboo, but it is completely clean. It's the perfect joke because it creates so much tension. Oh my God. Oh my God. And then it releases that tension. And to me, that's what great jokes do, is they're a provocation. There was a comedian named Bill Hicks, who's kind of legendary in our community, who unfortunately died back in the early 90s. But he was known for being edgy. He actually, his set got banned from the Letterman show and then later reinstated, and Letterman apologized to his mother for not having it on. But Bill Hicks, every one of his setups was a provocation. Just the setup was some sort of provocation that made everybody go, ooh. And then the punchline would release all of that tension. And so that's why I like that joke. What do you think of that joke?
Is it true that the highest priced live comedians at conventions are overwhelmingly people who say dirty jokes, erotic comedy, profane language?
I don't think so. I don't have any evidence.
Corporate conventions? What do you mean by conventions?
Yeah, I mean, like Sarah Silverman, for example. She's one of the highest paid now.
Oh, I see, yeah. To me, I mean, I love Sarah Silverman. Jokes about sex, they think it's edgy, but how hard is it to get a laugh about sex, you know?
Well, it is, but the reason they work is because it is something so private, and so it creates that very tension that I was talking about with the joke I just told.
Right.
And so when you're dealing with the taboo like that, then you have a way of, releasing that tension. It's going to be funny.
Well, can we wrap it up?
Yeah, let's wrap it up.
By the way, neither Steve or I were on Saturday Night Live.
I was on 3 times.
3-timer club.
But I would never get on now. I mean, those days are all gone. It's completely different now.
Yeah.
What they would choose. But I was on 2 cameo and 1 host. They would never have anybody like me now.
Oh, I don't know if you want to bring this up. The Dean Martin they roasted you on the Dean Martin show.
Yeah, that was very hard because I had to spontaneously respond, and I really didn't have the skill to do that in that milieu. So it didn't come across, to me, it didn't come across very funny what I was saying. But, that was part of the show. You listen to them, and you're supposed to improvise a response. That's tough for me. Whereas Saturday Night Live, you pretty much know what you're going to say because so many rehearsals.
Right. If you were to do a roast show like that today, they would have writers prepare material for you for all occasions.
Yeah, they wouldn't take any chances.
Right.
Okay.
Well, that's our show.
A transcript of this episode will be posted on RalphNaderRadioHour.com.
For Ralph's weekly blog, go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to CorporateCrimeReporter.com.
Remember to visit the country's only law museum, the American Museum of Tort Law in Winsted, Connecticut. Go to tortmuseum.org.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin.
Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We'll talk to you then, Ralph.
Thank you very much, Steve, David, Jimmy, and for the listeners, go to rowecenter.org, R-O-W-E, center.org, to see about a workshop of action and training in an era of Trump.